The voice cut through the string quartet like a blade finding a seam, clean, contemptuous, and loud enough to carry to every corner of the Fairmont Royal York's grand ballroom. Is this a joke? Rowan Ashford held the sweater above his head, the way a person holds up evidence of something embarrassing, pinching it at the collar between two fingers as though the wool itself might contaminate him. And the ballroom. 300 guests in black tie, all of them from the top tier of Bay Street, of Queen's Park, of the kind of Toronto money that doesn't need to announce itself because it never learned how to be quiet. Erupted with the particular laughter of people who had been waiting all evening for exactly this kind of permission to be unkind. The woman standing at the edge of the gift table did not flinch. She did not reach for her champagne, or look toward the exits, or allow her expression to shift by a single degree. Her name was Camille Adetokunbo, and she had learned to be still inside rooms that wanted her to be small long before she could afford the coat she was wearing that night. The sweater was hand-knitted, gray wool the shade of winter mornings in Scarborough. The shade of the apartment she grew up in above the pharmacy on Lawrence Avenue, where the radiator clanked through the cold months and her grandmother sat by the window, with her needles moving fast in the low light, teaching a 7-year-old girl that the most patient kind of love was made by hand and meant to last. Camille had spent 3 months on it. Early mornings, late at night, during the hour before the day began that was still hers alone. 3 months of her own hands, her own time, the only thing she still possessed that no amount of money could replicate or accelerate. Rowan did not know that. Rowan had never thought to ask. 300 people in this room, he said, louder now, performing for the crowd that had already given him its approval. And my girlfriend brings me something that looks like it came from a church rummage sale. The woman beside him, Portia Devereaux, who had arrived with an envelope containing a weekend reservation at a private club in Muskoka, and the particular ease of someone who had never once experienced a thing she hadn't chosen on purpose, laughed, the laugh that had been running just underneath the surface of the whole evening, the one she had been building toward, since the moment Camille walked in, and Portia had glanced at the modest package in her hands and made a quiet comment to the woman on her left that set the nearest table whispering. Rowan turned to Portia then, and the look he gave her was the look of a man who had already made his choice and was only now admitting it out loud. Portia brought me a cashmere blazer, he said, custom-tailored, shipped from London. He gestured toward Camille without turning to face her fully, the way a person gestures at a piece of furniture that needs to be moved. You're supposed to be in tech. You couldn't manage something that at least looked like you tried? Camille looked at the sweater still dangling from his hand. She looked at the 299 people arranged around her in the grand ballroom, some of them filming, some of them staring into their drinks, with the discomfort of people who had witnessed something they couldn't unsee, but also couldn't bring themselves to interrupt. She looked at Rowan Ashford, senior partner at Ashford and Keel, one of the most respected names on Bay Street, the man she had shared 3 years of her life with. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, gently took the sweater from between his fingers, folded it along its original creases, as though it had not just been the centerpiece of a public performance, and tucked it under her arm. She turned and walked toward the far set of doors. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not say a single word that anyone in that room would remember, because dignity, she had decided long before that evening, was not something you performed for an audience. It was something you kept for yourself, particularly in the moments when everyone around you was watching to see whether you'd lose it. She was 12 steps from the exit when 300 phones buzzed simultaneously. To understand what happened next, it helps to go back to the beginning of a life that bore almost no resemblance to the one most people in that ballroom would have predicted for her. Camille Adetokunbo grew up in Scarborough. Not the polished edge of Scarborough that gets written about in real estate supplements, but the interior of it. The stretch of Lawrence Avenue East, where the rent was monthly prayer territory, where a good week meant the fridge stayed full past Wednesday, where her mother worked double shifts at Centenary Hospital, and her grandmother sat by the window every evening with her knitting needles and a specific Ghanaian proverb for every situation the world cared to throw at a young girl learning to navigate it. Her grandmother's favorite: "The ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people." She applied it broadly to neighbors who let their yards go, to politicians on the television, to Camille herself on the days she came home from school, having decided that what other people thought of her mattered more than what she thought of herself. By the time Camille was 16, she had taught herself to code on a secondhand computer from a thrift shop on Kingston Road. By 22, she had a computer science degree from the University of Toronto and a $3,000 line of credit that served as her entire operating budget for the first 18 months of Vela Technologies. She slept on her cousin's couch in Regent Park. She ate a lot of rice. She wrote code for 12 hours a day in a shared workspace above a dry cleaner on Bloor Street, where the fumes came through the vents in summer and the heat barely came through the pipes in winter. 14 years later, Vela Technologies was one of the largest cloud infrastructure companies in the country, with offices in Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, and a valuation that had crossed a threshold Camille had never allowed herself to say out loud because her grandmother had always told her that the mouth should not get ahead of the hands. The hands, in this case, had gotten very far ahead on their own. She had not kept her wealth a secret out of deception. She kept it the way her grandmother had kept her proverbs, held close, not hidden, but not thrown around rooms where they weren't yet needed. She drove the same Subaru she'd bought at 40. She still lived in a 3-bedroom house in East York that she'd purchased during a year when everyone told her the neighborhood was a questionable investment. She still went to the same Ghanaian restaurant on Danforth Avenue every Friday, always sat at the same table by the window, always ordered the same jollof. She had told Rowan she worked in tech. She had described Vela as a software company, which was not a lie, only incomplete. She had not corrected him when he assumed, over the course of 3 years, that she was comfortably employed rather than the person whose name appeared on the incorporation documents, the board resolutions, the annual reports that no one at his firm had apparently thought to cross-reference with the woman he was dating. She had not told him because she wanted, more than almost anything she had wanted since childhood, to know whether a man would choose to stand beside her before he understood what standing beside her was worth. Her grandmother had been specific about this too. Not the proverb kind of specific, but the particular irreversible kind that comes from watching your own daughter marry a man who loved the idea of a future she hadn't yet built, and left the moment he understood she would build it entirely on her own terms. Know who a person is in the plain light, her grandmother used to say, before you show them the shine. 3 years of the plain light. And then one night at the Fairmont Royal York, in front of 300 people, she found out exactly who he was. The evening of Rowan's firm anniversary gala had begun the way evenings like that always began, with Portia Devereaux arriving exactly 6 minutes before Camille did, positioning herself at Rowan's elbow in a green dress that made her look like a woman who had never once experienced a thing she hadn't chosen on purpose. Portia and Rowan had dated briefly 7 years ago, before Rowan's ambition had outpaced his patience for old money's slower rhythms. They had remained in each other's orbit the way people do when the original connection never entirely resolved. Circling without committing, always available to the other as a reference point, a reminder of a particular kind of self. Over the previous several months, as Rowan's evenings with Camille had grown rarer and his calendar increasingly full, Portia had reappeared with increasing frequency. Charity events, the same dinners. The offhand comment left in a room after she departed, the kind that stuck to a listener's memory like a burr on wool. Camille had noticed. She said nothing. She understood that some things sort themselves if you give them enough of the plain light. At the gala, Portia had found her moment in the gift opening, a tradition at Ashford and Keel gatherings that Camille had found slightly excessive but never thought to question. When someone at Portia's end of the table suggested that Rowan open the presents right there, all of them, publicly, in the spirit of the celebration, the suggestion had Portia's fingerprints on it, even if her voice hadn't carried it directly across the room. Rowan had agreed the way he always agreed to things that reflected well on him, immediately, and with visible pleasure. The gifts were as one would expect from Bay Street at a 10-year milestone. Architect-designed cufflinks, a first-edition legal text sourced from a firm in Edinburgh, a private tasting at a Niagara-on-the-Lake winery. Each one greeted with appreciative murmurs, the collective nod of people who recognized a gift calibrated correctly to its recipient. Camille's package was last. Small, cloth-wrapped in a piece of fabric her grandmother had carried from Accra in 1978 and given to Camille the Christmas before she died. The kind of wrapping that announced nothing about its contents, except that the person who gave it had thought carefully about the outside as well as what was within. Rowan unwrapped it without looking at Camille. His expression registered the sweater the way a certain kind of person registers an incorrect wine, a brief, visible displeasure followed by the decision to make that displeasure public rather than manage it privately. And then he said what he said, and the room laughed what it laughed, and Portia's face arranged itself into the expression it had been waiting all evening to wear. And Camille walked toward the door with the sweater under her arm and her spine straight, and her face, carrying nothing she had not chosen to put there. She was 12 steps from the exit when 300 phones buzzed simultaneously. The notification arrived on every device in the ballroom at precisely the same moment, pushed by 5 separate news outlets within seconds of each other. Someone near the bar said, "Oh," in a voice that was not quite a whisper. Someone else said, "Wait." A third person turned their phone over and read the headline on the screen twice before turning to show it to the person beside them. Vela Technologies confirms $4.9 billion acquisition, largest tech exit in Canadian history. Below the headline, in the photograph that every Canadian business publication had run at least once in the past 2 years, the CEO and founder of Vela Technologies looked directly into the camera with the particular composure of someone who had been photographed in consequential rooms, long enough that the rooms had stopped meaning anything special. Her name, printed in the caption, was Camille Adetokunbo. The sound that moved through the ballroom was not quite silence. It was the absence of whatever had been present before. The conversation, the string quartet, the laughter, replaced by a specific quality of collective comprehension arriving in 300 minds at almost the same instant. A woman near the gift table looked at her phone, then toward the door where Camille had just been standing, then back at her phone. Her mouth opened and did not close. Rowan stood very still. The cashmere blazer Portia had given him was folded over his forearm. He held his champagne flute in his other hand and did not drink from it. The man who reached the door first was Franklin Addo, Vela's head of communications, who had been standing outside with a car for the past 40 minutes, because Camille's assistant had texted him that the evening was running long and his presence might be needed before the night was done. Franklin entered the ballroom in the unhurried way of someone who had been in rooms far more consequential than this one, found Camille still 2 steps from the threshold, and said something quiet enough that the nearest guests could not hear it. Camille listened, nodded once, looked back at the room. Her gaze moved across 300 faces with the same steadiness she had brought to every room she had entered, since she was a girl from Scarborough who learned early that the only thing a room could take from you was what you chose to leave behind in it. She did not speak to Rowan. She did not speak to Portia. She turned, walked through the door that Franklin held open, and stepped into the autumn night where her car was waiting at the curb, the city moving around her exactly as it always had, indifferent to the particular unravelings of particular evenings, steady and continuous and entirely unconcerned. Rowan called her 11 times between the moment she left and 2 o'clock in the morning. The calls went unanswered and eventually stopped connecting, which meant she had blocked Sabra at some point between the ballroom and wherever she had gone, and the specificity of that action, not ignoring him, but actively choosing to make herself unreachable, sat in his chest for the rest of the night like a stone he couldn't find the shape of. He went to her house in East York the following morning. The lights were off and her Subaru was gone, and a neighbor walking a retriever looked at him with the particular blankness of someone who knew something and had decided not to share it. He went to the Vila Technologies offices on King Street West that afternoon, arriving without an appointment the way a person does when they have run out of calculated approaches. The receptionist, a young man in a gray cardigan who had been with the company 4 years and had watched his CEO handle situations considerably more complex than this one, told him politely but without room for negotiation that Ms. Adetokunbo was not available and that he was welcome to submit a written inquiry through the company's general communications channel. 3 days later, a story ran in the Globe's business section. The following week, another in the Star. The acquisition of Vela Technologies was the kind of news that reshaped conversations at every level of Canadian business, and at the center of it was of a woman who had built the whole thing herself from a second-hand computer in a Scarborough bedroom, over 14 years, with no inherited capital and no family connections, and a degree from a university that Rowan's own colleagues had sometimes referred to, in the particular shorthand of Bay Street, as the kind of school you attended when the other schools hadn't worked out. Rowan read the pieces with an attention he had never brought to anything Camille had said about her own life. He read the earlier profile from Canadian Business, the interview she had given to a tech podcast 3 years ago, the year they started dating, in which she spoke about keeping her personal life deliberately separate from her professional identity. He read the McLean's story from 2 years prior that had placed her on a list of the country's most influential business leaders. He read all of it and understood, for the first time, that none of it had reached him previously because he had never thought to look. He thought about the evenings she came home from what he now understood had been board meetings, and the way she had redirected his questions about her day, with a brevity he had interpreted as tiredness, rather than a woman protecting something she had not yet decided to trust him with. He thought about the time, 8 months earlier, when she had mentioned almost parenthetically that she was thinking about restructuring her team, and he had told her not to overthink it, that people in her position sometimes created problems by trying to solve too many things at once. She had looked at him for a moment before agreeing pleasantly that he had a point. He had taken her agreement at face value and moved on to talk about something that interested him more. He thought about the sweater. 3 months of handwork. The fabric from something her grandmother had carried across an ocean. He had held it up in front of 300 people and asked if she was joking. He sat with that for a long time. The consequences arrived with the methodical certainty of a season changing. 2 clients who had been in the ballroom that night, both of whom held Vela Technologies in their portfolio, called within the week to discuss representation going forward. One conversation was polite. The other was brief. Both ended with decisions that cost Ashford and Keel a combined amount that Rowan did not discuss with anyone directly, but that his partners would reference, without naming him specifically, at the quarterly review. Portia issued a statement through a publicist, describing herself as a longtime family friend of the Ashford family, who had attended the evening in a purely social capacity. She had nothing to do with whatever had occurred between Rowan and his girlfriend, and was saddened that the evening unfolded as it had. The statement was 3 sentences long, and she had clearly written it herself, because the particular rhythm of it, the way it placed her in a blameless position while subtly underlining her connection to the Ashford name, was recognizably hers. Rowan did not call Portia after that night. He understood, in the way people understand things when they are too late to change them, that she had engineered the evening's public moment the way an architect engineers a controlled demolition. From a safe distance, with total plausible deniability, and a very clear idea of what the rubble would clear space for. He had simply been the instrument. He had done that willingly, in the span of a single breath, for the sake of a room's laughter. He kept thinking about Camille's face. Not during the humiliation, though that image also stayed with him, the deliberate stillness of it, the careful absence of what he had expected her to feel. But earlier in the evening, before the gifts, when she had been standing by the east windows talking to an older couple from his firm's litigation team, she had been entirely at ease, asking questions, and actually listening to the answers, laughing at something the woman said about her grandchildren. And Rowan had watched her from across the room and thought, for a moment, that she looked like she belonged to herself in a way he admired without quite understanding. He had not walked over to join her. He had gone to find Portia instead. Camille appeared publicly for the first time, 6 weeks after the gala, at a breakfast event hosted by the Black Business and Professional Association of Canada, where she announced a new Vela Foundation scholarship program for young women from lower-income communities pursuing degrees in computer science and engineering. She wore a dark green dress and spoke without notes for 14 minutes about growing up in Scarborough and the particular kind of stubbornness required to build something from nothing when the room consistently expects you to be somewhere else. She took no questions about the gala, about Rowan, or about the footage several guests had uploaded that night, and that had circulated with the particular speed of content people find morally uncomplicated enough to share freely. When a journalist asked afterward how she was doing personally, she said she was very well and that she appreciated the question. The scholarship program received 412 applications in its first week. Rowan attended the breakfast. He had not been invited, and he did not approach the stage. He stood near the back of the room, among 200 people he mostly did not know, and he watched Camille speak with the same composure she had walked out of the ballroom carrying, and he understood for the first time, with genuine clarity, that what he was watching was not a woman who had been damaged by what he did and recovered from it. It was a woman for whom what he did had been, in the end, clarifying. She had walked out of the ballroom, carrying everything that mattered to her, and she had not left a single thing behind that she needed. He waited outside afterward, in the gray November morning, and asked whether she might give him a few minutes. She agreed. They walked to a small parquet nearby, bare trees and the smell of Lake Ontario somewhere below the skyline, and Rowan talked for a long time. He did not offer excuses. He said he had spent 6 weeks replaying the evening and understood now that what he had done to her in front of 300 people was not the worst of what he had done. The worst of it was the 3 years before. The ways he had not seen her. The questions he had not thought to ask. The version of her he had constructed from the pieces she offered and the assumptions he chose to make with the rest. He said he had loved her. He said he believed that. He said he was asking not for anything she could no longer give him, but simply for her to know that the man standing in that November park was not the same man who had held up her sweater and asked if she was joking, and that if he could not make anything better, he at least wanted her to know the difference existed. Camille listened to all of it without interrupting, her expression steady in the way it had been the night of the gala. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him a question. If I had walked into that gala as the woman you believed I was, someone mid-level at a software company, driving a Subaru, no profile in any publication, nothing behind my name that could change anything for you, would you be standing here right now? Rowan opened his mouth. He closed it. The silence that came out of him was its own kind of answer, and they both already knew it. Camille looked at him without hardness, without the particular satisfaction of a person who has proven a point. She said that she had spent her entire life building things that were real. Code, companies. The kind of character her grandmother had insisted was the only currency that couldn't be devalued, and that she had wanted, above everything, to know that the person beside her could see all of that before they understood what it was worth. She told him that whatever they had shared, she carried the real parts of it with her, and always would. She told him she hoped he built something honest with the time he had left, and she meant every word of it. Then she turned and walked toward the car at the edge of the parquet, and Rowan stood among the bare November trees and watched it pull away and merge into the steady motion of the city until it was gone entirely from view. A year passed, and then another, and the city moved the way cities do, restlessly, indifferently, accumulating new things on top of what came before, the old layers visible only to people who knew where to look. The Vela Foundation expanded its scholarship program into universities in Halifax, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. Camille hired a small team to manage the applications, but continued to read the finalist essays herself, sitting at the kitchen table in her East York house on Sunday mornings, because she still remembered what it felt like to be a young woman from Scarborough, with a specific kind of mind and no clear path for using it, and she wanted every finalist to know that someone with the power to read their words had actually done so. She still went to the Jollof restaurant on Danforth every Friday. She still drove the Subaru. She still sat by the east window on winter mornings with her grandmother's knitting needles moving through the quiet, though she had not yet decided what she was making. She had kept the gray sweater, folded in the top drawer of her dresser, not as a wound and not as a monument, but as a reminder of the kind of love she had poured into the world and fully intended to pour again, when she found someone worthy of receiving it. Rowan left Ashford and Kiel 8 months after the gala and took a position at a smaller firm outside the city, one where his reputation had not preceded him. He spent his first winter there doing something that surprised even him, volunteering Tuesday evenings at a legal clinic in his new neighborhood, offering free consultations to people who could not otherwise afford one. No one there knew him by name from any headline or any footage. He was simply the lawyer who showed up on Tuesdays and listened carefully, with the particular attention of someone who had recently come to understand what it cost and what it meant to actually pay attention to another person. They saw each other once more the following spring at an opening at the Art Gallery of Ontario, a retrospective of Ghanaian textile artists that Camille's foundation had helped support. She was near the entrance when he arrived, speaking to the artist, both of them animated, her hand moving as she described something specific about a piece on the far wall. She noticed him across the room a few minutes later. He noticed her noticing him. Something passed between them in that half-second. Not warmth, not hostility, but the particular acknowledgement of two people who have moved through the same difficult passage and come out carrying different things, on separate paths that no longer ran in the same direction. Camille gave him a small, polite nod, the kind given to someone from a previous chapter of a life that had many more chapters still to come. Rowan returned it with something quieter, something that carried no asking in it at all. She turned back to the artist. The conversation resumed around her. The gallery moved on around her. The city moved on beyond the tall windows, its restless, ordinary motion continuing exactly as it had before any of this began, and Camille stood inside it fully herself, not despite everything that had happened, but in some honest and uncomplicated way, because of it. She stayed until the gallery closed. She walked out into the spring night with the gray wool sweater folded over her arm, because the evening had turned cool and she had thought to bring it, and because some things you make with your own hands are simply worth keeping.